The courtroom fell silent as Judge Henderson's gavel struck the bench 3 times. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled against the wooden rail, her knuckles white as bone, watching through the rain-streaked courthouse window, where amber eyes stared back at her from the animal control van. 18 months ago, she thought she'd rescued an abandoned puppy from a storm-ravaged highway. The bailiff's keys jangled like wind chimes as he stepped forward, his face grave with the weight of what came next. Phantom's howl pierced through the glass and concrete, a sound that made grown men in the gallery cover their ears and children begin to cry. Sarah's grandmother's locket, the only family heirloom she had left, caught the fluorescent light as her chest heaved with barely controlled sobs. She'd worn it the night she found him, tiny and dying in that overturned truck, never knowing this moment would come. "Remove the animal immediately," Judge Henderson commanded, her voice cutting through Sarah's heart like a blade. Who decides when love becomes illegal? And why did saving one life feel like losing everything? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that broken hearts ran in families, passed down like heirloom china or her grandmother's wedding ring. At 28, she'd already buried more dreams than most people twice her age, but somehow she kept showing up to Austin General Hospital every night, tending to other people's children in the pediatric ward while her own arms remained empty. The inheritance house on Maple Street had been both blessing and burden, a modest 2-bedroom with creaking floors and memories that whispered from every corner. Her grandmother's voice still echoed in the kitchen where mason jars lined the windowsill, and her parents' laughter seemed to drift from the living room where their wedding photo still held court on the mantel. 12 years since the accident, and Sarah still set the table for 3 on Sundays out of habit. Eleanor Thompson lived next door in a house that smelled of lavender sachets and old books. At 78, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned to make every step count. Her husband's Purple Heart sat on the mantel beside 40 years of Christmas cards from former students, and her kitchen window faced Sarah's with the precision of someone who'd appointed herself unofficial guardian of the neighborhood. "Honey, you can't save everyone," Eleanor would say, watching Sarah leave for another double shift. But Eleanor understood the trying. She'd been collecting strays for 50 years, from 3-legged cats to heartbroken neighbors. 3 blocks away, Captain Marcus Webb sat in his government office surrounded by case files and citations, photographs of exotic animals that had ended badly decorating his walls like warnings. His uniform hung perfectly pressed each morning, covering the deep scars that never quite healed, not the visible ones from his son's accident, but the invisible wounds that kept him awake at night. Tommy Webb's wheelchair had been the family's 3rd resident for 3 years now, ever since the night Marcus received the call about an illegal tiger cub that had gotten loose from an unlicensed facility. Racing through red lights to reach the scene, Marcus never saw the drunk driver who T-boned their family sedan. The tiger cub was recaptured safely. His 10-year-old son would never walk again. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. A man whose job involved protecting people from dangerous animals had failed to protect his own child from the most dangerous animal of all, human negligence. Now he enforced every regulation with the fervor of the converted, believing that rules existed for reasons written in other people's blood. Down the street, 82-year-old Frank Rodriguez tended his victory garden with hands that still remembered the weight of an M1 rifle in Korea. His wife Rosa had been gone 5 years, but he still made enough coffee for 2 and left her favorite radio station playing while he worked the soil. These were the people who would become Sarah's unlikely army, though none of them knew it yet as autumn settled over Austin like a held breath, waiting for the storm that would change everything. The storm hit Austin like God's own temper tantrum, turning Highway 71 into a river of headlights and regret. Sarah's windshield wipers fought a losing battle against sheets of rain that seemed to fall sideways, and her radio crackled with emergency dispatches that made her stomach clench. Another 12-hour shift at the hospital had left her running on caffeine and stubborn determination, but nothing could have prepared her for what waited around the bend near the Bastrop County line. The overturned delivery truck lay on its side like a sleeping giant, emergency flares painting the asphalt in hellish orange. Sarah pulled over without thinking, her nurse's training overriding every instinct that screamed for her to keep driving. The driver was conscious but dazed, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead as paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher. "The cargo," he mumbled, grabbing Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "Check the cargo." "Little one's been through enough already." Sarah followed his pointing finger to a small animal carrier that had been thrown clear of the wreckage, its metal frame dented but intact. Inside, pressed against the far corner, was what appeared to be a puppy, though unlike any puppy she'd ever seen. Its fur was silver-gray like moonlight on water, and when it looked up at her, amber eyes held an intelligence that made her breath catch. "Hey there, baby," she whispered, reaching through the carrier's bars. The creature didn't flinch or cower like most frightened animals. Instead, it studied her face with an intensity that felt almost human, as if measuring her soul and finding it acceptable. The paramedic appeared at her shoulder, clipboard in hand. "Animal control's been called, but with this storm could be hours before they show. Poor thing'll probably end up at the county shelter." Sarah knew what happened at the county shelter to animals that stayed too long. She'd volunteered there once, until the day she watched them put down a perfectly healthy German shepherd simply because no one had claimed him in 30 days. "I'll take him," she heard herself saying, the words tumbling out before her rational mind could protest. "Ma'am, you sure about that?" Driver was mumbling something about a research facility before he lost consciousness. Might be paperwork involved. But Sarah was already lifting the carrier, feeling the weight of the small life inside. The puppy, if that's what it was, pressed against the front of the cage, those amber eyes never leaving her face. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than species or circumstance. The drive home was a blur of storm-darkened streets and the soft, whimpering sounds coming from the carrier beside her. Sarah found herself talking to calm both their nerves. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. We'll get you warm and fed, and tomorrow we'll figure out where you belong." But deep down, she already suspected where he belonged. Her kitchen became a triage unit as Sarah gently coaxed the puppy from his carrier. He was smaller than she'd initially thought, maybe 12 weeks old, but his proportions seemed oddly mature for his size. His coat was thick and double-layered, designed for harsh winters rather than Texas heat, and his ears stood at attention like satellite dishes picking up signals from another world. Eleanor appeared at the back door within minutes, drawn by some supernatural neighbor sense that activated whenever drama unfolded on Maple Street. She took one look at the puppy and whistled low under her breath. "Honey, I've seen a lot of dogs in my time," Eleanor said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that had weathered 8 decades of Texas living. "But that's no ordinary mutt. Look at those paws, big as silver dollars. And those eyes." She trailed off, studying the puppy who was now exploring Sarah's kitchen with systematic thoroughness. "The driver mentioned a research facility," Sarah admitted, watching as the puppy approached her grandmother's old rocking chair and sniffed it with scientific precision. "But he was pretty banged up. Could have been talking about anything." Eleanor's expression darkened. "Research facility, you say? Honey, there's been talk around town about some kind of breeding operation out past Cedar Creek. Nothing official, mind you, but my nephew Jimmy works for the county, and he's heard things." The puppy had completed his exploration and returned to Sarah's side, sitting with perfect posture and fixing those amber eyes on her face again. Without thinking, she reached down to stroke his head, and he leaned into her touch with a contentment that felt like coming home. "What should I call you?" she murmured, and his ears twitched as if he understood the question. Outside, thunder rolled across the Texas sky like a promise of more storms to come, but inside Sarah's kitchen, something warmer than weather was beginning to bloom. "How about Phantom?" Eleanor suggested. "Appeared out of nowhere in the storm, like a ghost looking for his family." The puppy's tail gave a single wag of approval, and Sarah Mitchell's life changed forever. 8 weeks transformed Sarah's quiet house into something that hummed with purpose and unexpected joy. Phantom grew with the relentless efficiency of summer grass, his puppy fluff giving way to a thick silver-gray coat that caught light like spun metal. By 12 weeks, he'd outgrown every collar Sarah bought, and his amber eyes had developed an intelligence that made visitors stop mid-sentence and stare. "That dog's reading my mind," Frank Rodriguez muttered one morning, watching Phantom anticipate his every movement as he tended the shared fence line between their properties. The old Korean War veteran had seen enough in his 82 years to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him this was no ordinary animal. Eleanor noticed it too. "Honey, I've raised 6 dogs and fostered dozens more," she told Sarah over their morning coffee ritual. "But I've never seen one learn commands that fast, or watch television like he's actually following the plot." Phantom had indeed become fascinated with the nature documentaries Sarah played while doing paperwork from the hospital. He'd sit perfectly still for hours, head tilted, studying wolves running across Arctic tundra with an attention that bordered on homesickness. When coyotes appeared on screen, his ears would flatten, and he'd whine softly, as if recognizing distant relatives. The first real warning came from Mrs. Patterson 3 houses down, a woman whose hobby was collecting grievances like other people collected stamps. She cornered Sarah at the mailbox one Tuesday morning, clutching her tiny chihuahua like a furry shield. "That animal of yours is getting too big," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd served on the Homeowners Association board for 15 years. "Princess here is scared to go outside anymore. And the way it looks at people, it's not natural." Sarah glanced down at Phantom, who was sitting at heel position with the patience of a meditation master. At 4 months old, he now weighed close to 45 pounds and stood knee-high to Sarah's legs. His shoulders had broadened, and his snout was longer and more tapered than she remembered from puppyhood. "He's never shown aggression toward anyone," Sarah said diplomatically, though her heart was beginning to race with a fear she couldn't name. "It's not aggression I'm worried about," Mrs. Patterson sniffed. "It's what happens when that thing realizes how big it is." That afternoon, Sarah made an appointment with Dr. James Harrison at Austin Veterinary Clinic. She'd been putting off a formal checkup, partly due to finances, and partly due to an inexplicable dread that had been growing alongside Phantom's impressive size. Dr. Harrison had been Austin's most trusted veterinarian for 20 years, a man whose gentle hands had delivered foals and eased the passing of beloved family pets with equal compassion. He was also, Sarah had to admit, exactly the kind of man her grandmother would have called a keeper. Steady brown eyes, calloused hands that spoke of honest work, and a way of listening that made people feel heard. Phantom submitted to the examination with dignified cooperation, though his amber eyes never left Sarah's face throughout the process. Dr. Harrison worked in thoughtful silence, measuring, weighing, checking reflexes and responses. When he finally stepped back from the examination table, his expression was carefully neutral. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," he said, washing his hands with the deliberate motions of someone buying time. "Where exactly did you say you found Phantom?" The story poured out again. The storm, the overturned truck, the injured driver's cryptic words about a research facility. Dr. Harrison nodded along, making notes on a chart that he kept turned away from Sarah's view. "I'm going to need to run some tests," he said finally. "Blood work, genetic screening. There are some characteristics that concern me." "What kind of characteristics?" Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. Dr. Harrison sat down on the rolling stool, bringing himself to eye level with her. Outside the examination room, she could hear the normal sounds of a veterinary clinic: dogs barking, cats yowling, the comforting murmur of staff going about their daily routines. But inside this small room, the air felt thick with impending change. "Sarah, when I look at Phantom's bone structure, his coat pattern, the shape of his skull and ears, I see characteristics that aren't typical of domestic dogs." He paused, choosing his words carefully. His proportions, his gait, even the way he holds himself, these are traits I associate with wild canines. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Phantom might not be the dog you think he is." Dr. Harrison's voice was gentle but firm. "And if I'm right, we have a serious legal problem on our hands." Outside, in the waiting room, Phantom sat perfectly still beside Sarah's chair, his massive head resting against her knee. Other pet owners gave them a wide berth, unconsciously responding to something primal in Phantom's presence. An elderly woman with a cat carrier whispered to her companion, "That's the biggest German Shepherd I've ever seen." If only it were that simple. 3 days later, Dr. Harrison called with results that would shatter Sarah's world into before and after. Phantom was 75% gray wolf, 25% German Shepherd, a hybrid that was illegal to own in the state of Texas without special permits that took years to obtain and cost more money than Sarah made in 6 months. Captain Marcus Webb received the required notification that same afternoon. Captain Marcus Webb arrived at Sarah's door on a Thursday morning when the Texas sun was already promising another scorcher, his state-issued vehicle parked with military precision at the curb. He wore his authority like a well-tailored uniform, pressed, official, and designed to intimidate. But Sarah noticed the way his eyes lingered on the child's bicycle, abandoned in her neighbor's yard, and how his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his badge. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Captain Webb with Texas Wildlife Control. I believe Dr. Harrison informed you I'd be coming." His voice carried the flat efficiency of someone who'd delivered bad news too many times to count. Phantom appeared at Sarah's side as if summoned, his massive frame filling the doorway. Webb took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward the radio clipped to his belt. The wolf dog studied him with those unsettling amber eyes, head tilted in what might have been curiosity or evaluation. "Jesus," Webb breathed, then caught himself. "Ma'am, I need you to secure that animal while we talk." "He's not going anywhere," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Phantom, sit!" The command was unnecessary. He'd already lowered himself into perfect sitting position, though his gaze never left Webb's face. Webb consulted his clipboard with the dedication of a man who found safety in paperwork. "According to the veterinary report, you're harboring a Class A dangerous animal without proper permits. Under Texas Parks and Wildlife Code, Section 43.95, possession of wolf hybrids is prohibited without a Class C breeder's license." "How much does a license cost?" Sarah asked, though the sinking feeling in her stomach suggested she already knew the answer. $45,000 application fee plus facility inspection requirements that typically run another $60,000 to $80,000. Annual renewals are $12,000. Webb's delivery was clinical, but Sarah caught something that might have been sympathy flickering behind his professional mask. Eleanor appeared from her garden, as if summoned by some neighborhood emergency broadcast system, still wearing her sun hat and carrying a hand trowel like a weapon. At 78, she moved with the determination of someone who'd seen enough government overreach to last several lifetimes. "Morning, officer," she called sweetly, using the tone she'd once reserved for students caught cheating on spelling tests. "I couldn't help but notice you're harassing my neighbor." "Ma'am, this is official state business." "This is ridiculous state business," Eleanor corrected, marching up her front steps to get a better view of the proceedings. "That animal's been living here peacefully for months. Haven't heard so much as a bark out of line." Webb's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, with all due respect, wolves are apex predators. They're hardwired for hunting and pack behavior. The fact that it hasn't shown aggression yet doesn't mean—" "Hardwired for hunting?" Frank Rodriguez's voice carried across the morning air as he approached from his own yard, coffee mug in hand. "Son, I've seen real predators. Spent 13 months in Korea watching them hunt in packs. This animal's been protecting our neighborhood, not threatening it." "Protecting?" Webb's eyebrows shot up. Frank nodded toward the Patterson house. 2 weeks ago, Princess Patterson, that's the little chihuahua, got loose and wandered into traffic. Your dangerous predator here blocked traffic with his own body until Mrs. Patterson could scoop up her dog. Didn't even occur to him to chase the little thing." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her elderly neighbor. She'd forgotten about that incident, but Frank's words painted Phantom in exactly the light she'd been struggling to find. Webb made a note on his clipboard, but his expression remained skeptical. "Mr. Rodriguez, Frank Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant, retired. Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate your observations, but my job is public safety, not neighborhood politics. Miss Mitchell, you have 30 days to either obtain proper licensing or surrender the animal to an approved facility." "And if the facilities won't take him?" Sarah asked. The silence that followed answered her question more clearly than words ever could. "There are several wildlife sanctuaries in the state that are already overcrowded and underfunded," Eleanor interrupted. "Don't sugarcoat it, young man. You're talking about a death sentence." Webb's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw underneath. "Ma'am, 3 years ago a family in Dallas thought they could handle an exotic animal. It ended with a 10-year-old boy in a wheelchair and a lawsuit that bankrupted everyone involved." "I won't let that happen again." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah watched Webb's face and saw something she recognized. The particular kind of pain that came from carrying someone else's broken dreams. "Your son," she said quietly. Webb's clipboard trembled in his hands. "My job is to enforce the law, Miss Mitchell. Nothing more." But Sarah had spent enough time in hospital corridors to recognize a parent's particular brand of anguish. She glanced down at Phantom, who was still sitting in perfect position, and made a decision that would change everything. "Give me the 30 days, she said. "I'll get the license." Webb stared at her for a long moment. "Miss Mitchell, do you understand what you're committing to? Even if you had the money, which, no offense, but I've seen your financial records, the facility requirements alone would take months to complete. Reinforced fencing, specialized shelter construction, emergency protocols, veterinary partnerships. I understand. The application process includes background checks, psychological evaluations, facility inspections, and a review board hearing. The failure rate is 97%. I understand. Webb closed his clipboard with a sharp snap. 30 days, Miss Mitchell. After that, this animal becomes a ward of the state. After he left, Sarah sank onto her front steps with Phantom's massive head in her lap. The morning sun beat down on them like a judgment, and for the first time since the night she'd found him, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of losing him. Eleanor settled beside her with the careful movements of someone whose bones had earned their protests. "Honey, that man's carrying a load of hurt." Did you see his hands shake when he looked at Phantom? I saw a father who's fighting ghosts, Eleanor said softly. But that doesn't make him wrong about the danger, sweetie. What you're proposing, it's not just difficult, it's nearly impossible. Frank joined them on the steps, his coffee grown cold during the confrontation. Nearly impossible isn't the same as impossible, he said with the practical optimism of someone who'd survived a war. Question is, what are you willing to sacrifice for family? That afternoon, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and drove to the Austin Public Library. She spent 8 hours researching wolf dog hybrid regulations, permit applications, and facility requirements. The numbers on her legal pad grew more daunting with each passing hour. $127,000 minimum for licensing and facility construction, plus ongoing costs that would dwarf her annual salary. She was about to close the laptop when a news article caught her eye. Online fundraising campaign saves family farm from foreclosure. The story detailed how a Texas family had raised $180,000 in 6 weeks through social media crowdfunding after their story went viral. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about the power of stories to change hearts and minds. Then she opened a new browser window and began typing. Help Me Save Phantom, a story of love, law, and the fight for family. By midnight, the fundraising page was live, complete with photos of Phantom's gentle interactions with neighborhood children and testimonials from Eleanor and Frank. Sarah hit the publish button with hands that shook almost as badly as Marcus Webb's had that morning. Within 24 hours, the campaign had raised $500. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. More importantly, it was hope. The fundraising campaign exploded across social media like wildfire in drought season. Within a week, #SavePhantom was trending on Twitter, and Sarah's inbox overflowed with messages from strangers who'd fallen in love with the amber-eyed wolf dog through grainy iPhone videos. The story had everything the internet craved: an underdog fighting impossible odds, government overreach threatening an innocent family, and a love story that transcended species. Local news station KVUE picked up the story first, sending a young reporter named Jessica Martinez to interview Sarah in her backyard. Phantom performed flawlessly, demonstrating his extensive vocabulary of commands and his gentle nature around children when the neighbor kids stopped by to pet him. The segment aired during the evening news, sandwiched between a city council budget dispute and high school football scores. By morning, the story had gone national. "Good Morning America wants to interview you," Eleanor announced, bursting through Sarah's back door with a cordless phone pressed to her ear. "Something about human interest and animal rights. Honey, you better sit down for this." The media attention brought support from unexpected corners. Wolf sanctuaries from Montana to Maine shared their stories. Veterinarians offered expert testimony about hybrid behavior, and animal rights attorneys began calling with offers of pro bono representation. The fundraising total climbed past $15,000, then $30,000, then kept climbing. But success bred its own problems. Austin Safe Streets, a local advocacy group led by City Councilman Robert Sterling, launched a counter-campaign with the hashtag #SafetyFirst. Their website featured photos of wolf attack victims and statistics about exotic animal incidents. Sterling himself appeared on local talk radio, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who'd built a career on other people's fears. "This isn't about one woman's pet," Sterling declared during his weekly call-in show. "This is about setting a precedent that puts every family in Austin at risk. Today it's a wolf dog. Tomorrow it could be a tiger or a bear. Where do we draw the line?" The protests started small, a handful of people with signs outside Sarah's house on weekday mornings. But as media coverage intensified, so did the opposition. Signs reading "Children's Safety Matters" and "No Wolves in Our Neighborhoods" appeared like mushrooms after rain. Marcus Webb found himself caught in the middle of a political firestorm he'd never intended to create. His supervisor, Director Patricia Hammond, called him into her office on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with bureaucratic tension. "Marcus, the governor's office has been asking questions," Hammond said, closing the door behind him with the soft click of administrative finality. "This Mitchell case has become a public relations nightmare. Half the state wants us to throw the book at her, the other half thinks we're jackbooted thugs persecuting a grieving woman." Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been following the media coverage with a mixture of professional interest and personal unease. The fundraising total had reached $85,000, and Sarah Mitchell had hired Lisa Chen, one of Austin's most aggressive civil rights attorneys. "The law is clear," Webb said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Wolf hybrids require special permits." "The law is also subject to interpretation," Hammond replied, sliding a thick folder across her desk. "I've been reviewing our enforcement history. Turns out we've got some inconsistencies in how we've handled similar cases." Webb opened the folder and immediately wished he hadn't. 3 years of selective enforcement stared back at him. Exotic bird owners who'd received warnings instead of citations, a man in Pflugerville who'd kept a mountain lion for 6 months before anyone noticed, and most damaging of all, a wealthy rancher in West Texas who'd been raising wolf hybrids for hunting purposes with permits that should never have been approved. "Sir, I wasn't aware." "Of course you weren't. Different districts, different standards, but Sarah Mitchell's attorney is very good at her job, and she's found every inconsistency we've tried to bury." Hammond leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking older than her 55 years. "The Attorney General's office is recommending we settle." "Settle how?" "Conditional licensing, house arrest for the animal, regular inspections, public safety protocols." "It's not ideal, but it keeps us out of federal court." Webb thought about his son, Tommy, who'd been following the story with the intensity of a 10-year-old boy obsessed with justice and fairness. Just last night, Tommy had asked why the government was trying to break up a family that loved each other. "What if we're wrong?" Webb asked quietly. Hammond studied him with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent 20 years navigating political waters. "Wrong about what?" "About the danger. What if this particular animal really is different?" Before Hammond could answer, Webb's radio crackled to life with an emergency dispatch that would change everything. "All units, we have a code red at 1247 Maple Street. Child in immediate danger. Animal involvement suspected." Sarah's address. Webb was in his truck and racing through Austin traffic before the dispatcher finished speaking. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white, and his mind conjured every nightmare scenario he'd spent 3 years trying to prevent. The drive to Maple Street felt like an eternity compressed into 8 agonizing minutes. He arrived to find chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the street, their red and blue lights painting the afternoon in stroboscopic panic. Neighbors clustered on sidewalks, phones out, recording everything for social media posterity. Mrs. Patterson stood in her front yard clutching Princess the Chihuahua, tears streaming down her face as she spoke to a police officer. Webb spotted Sarah immediately. She was kneeling beside an ambulance while paramedics worked on someone he couldn't see. Her shirt was torn and bloody, and Phantom sat pressed against her side, his amber eyes scanning the crowd with protective alertness. "What happened?" Webb demanded, approaching the nearest officer. Officer Martinez looked up from his notepad, his face grim. "Near drowning. 7-year-old boy fell into the retention pond behind the houses. Lucky thing that animal was there." Webb's world tilted on its axis. "The animal?" "Wolf dog jumped the fence and pulled the kid out. 30 seconds later and we'd be looking at a body recovery instead of a rescue." Martinez gestured toward the ambulance where Sarah was holding the hand of a small Hispanic boy who was conscious but wrapped in emergency blankets. The boy's injuries? Hypothermia, some water in his lungs, but he'll be fine. Animal never touched him except to grab his shirt and drag him to shore. Martinez shook his head in amazement. Damnedest thing I've ever seen. Like that wolf knew exactly what to do. Webb walked slowly toward the ambulance, his mind struggling to process this reversal of everything he'd expected to find. Sarah looked up as he approached, her eyes red with tears but blazing with a fierce protectiveness. "He saved Miguel," she said simply. "He jumped a 6-foot fence to save a child he'd never met." Webb looked down at Phantom, who was now accepting gentle pats from Miguel's grateful parents. The wolf dog's coat was still damp from the pond, and mud caked his powerful legs, but his expression remained calm and alert. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Webb began to question everything he thought he knew about dangerous animals. The rescue should have been Sarah's vindication, proof positive that Phantom was a protector rather than a predator. Instead, it became the match that lit a powder keg of controversy that exploded across Austin like a summer thunderstorm. Within hours, dueling video clips flooded social media, some showing Phantom's heroic rescue of 7-year-old Miguel Hernandez, others featuring Robert Sterling's inflammatory press conference where he called the incident a lucky accident that doesn't erase the fundamental danger. "One heroic moment doesn't change basic biology," Sterling declared from the steps of City Hall, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a politician who'd learned to weaponize fear. "Wolves are pack hunters. They're hardwired for violence. What happens when this animal decides the next child looks like prey instead of something to rescue?" The counter-protests intensified overnight. By Wednesday morning, Sarah's quiet street had become a battleground between Team Phantom supporters carrying signs reading, "Heroes come in all species," and Austin Safe Streets activists whose chants of public safety first echoed off the suburban houses like a war drum. Eleanor watched the chaos from her front window with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many good causes destroyed by extremism. "Honey, this is getting out of hand," she told Sarah as they stood in the kitchen, curtains drawn against the media circus outside. "Maybe you should consider—" "Don't!" Sarah's voice carried a sharpness that surprised them both. "Don't you dare suggest I give up on him." But the pressure was taking its toll. Sarah had been forced to take unpaid leave from the hospital after protesters began showing up at Austin General with signs demanding her termination. The fundraising campaign had stalled at $127,000, tantalizingly close to their goal but still short of what they needed for full licensing. Worse, the city council had fast-tracked an emergency ordinance that would ban all exotic animals within city limits, effectively making Phantom's continued residence illegal regardless of state permits. The breaking point came on Friday evening when Sarah returned from a meeting with her attorney to find 3 masked figures in her backyard, one carrying what appeared to be a tranquilizer gun. Phantom's low growl was the only warning she got before the men scattered, vaulting the fence like shadows fleeing daylight. They were going to take him, Sarah told Detective Rodriguez, Frank's nephew, as they stood in her living room an hour later. "If I hadn't come home when I did, we'll dust for prints, increase patrols, but honestly, these guys were professionals." No cameras caught them, no neighbors saw anything useful. Detective Rodriguez closed his notepad with the frustrated snap of a cop who'd run out of leads. "Ma'am, I have to ask, have you considered that maybe it's time to find Phantom a safer home?" Sarah's answer was interrupted by the crash of breaking glass from the front of the house. A brick had sailed through her living room window, wrapped in a note that read, "Wolves belong in the wild or in graves." Phantom stood between Sarah and the shattered glass, hackles raised, a low rumble emanating from his chest that spoke of ancient promises between protector and protected. That night, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She called Marcus Webb at home, her voice hollow with defeat. "I want to arrange the surrender, this weekend, before someone gets hurt." Webb's silence stretched so long she thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strange gentleness. "Sarah, what happened to change your mind?" "I can't keep him safe," she admitted, the words tearing at her throat like broken glass. "The protesters, the threats. Tonight someone tried to. I can't protect him from this. Maybe you were right. Maybe love isn't enough." "There's a facility in Montana," Webb said quietly. "Big Sky Wolf Sanctuary. They're good people, and they've agreed to take him. He'd have a good life there." "How long?" "How long what? How long do I have with him?" Another pause. "Transportation is scheduled for Monday morning." Sarah hung up and sank to the floor beside Phantom's massive form. He seemed to sense the change in her emotional weather, pressing his head against her chest while she sobbed into his thick fur. Outside, the protesters had gone home, leaving only the broken glass and shattered dreams of their visit. Eleanor found them there at dawn, curled together on the living room floor like survivors of a shipwreck. The older woman moved with uncharacteristic silence, making coffee and cleaning up the glass, while Sarah and Phantom maintained their vigil. Frank appeared shortly after, his weathered hands carrying a toolbox and enough plywood to cover the broken window. "Don't suppose you want company this weekend," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact as he measured the window frame. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The final weekend passed like a fever dream. Phantom seemed to understand something was ending. He stayed closer to Sarah than usual, following her from room to room with a patience that broke her heart. They walked the neighborhood one last time, past Mrs. Patterson's house where the little chihuahua no longer yapped at the fence, past the retention pond where Phantom had pulled Miguel to safety, past all the small landmarks of their brief life together. On Sunday evening, Sarah sat on her back steps with Phantom's head in her lap, watching the sun set over Austin's sprawling skyline. The protesters were gone, the media had moved on to newer controversies, and the world felt strangely quiet after weeks of chaos. "You saved me first, you know," she whispered to him, stroking the silver-gray fur she'd come to know better than her own heartbeat. "That night in the storm, when you looked at me through those cage bars, you saved me from being alone." Phantom's amber eyes reflected the dying light, ancient and knowing and heartbreakingly trusting. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of a funeral. The transport van from Big Sky Sanctuary pulled up at exactly 8 a.m., driven by a kind-faced woman named Janet, who spoke softly about the other wolves who would become Phantom's new pack. Sarah signed papers with hands that shook like autumn leaves, officially transferring custody of the creature who'd become her entire world. The last thing Sarah saw was Phantom's face through the van's rear window, amber eyes fixed on hers until distance and tears made him disappear. 3 weeks after Phantom disappeared into the Montana wilderness, Sarah's world crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The sanctuary called on a Tuesday morning with news that shattered what remained of her carefully constructed composure. Phantom had escaped during a routine enclosure cleaning, vanishing into the Glacier National Park wilderness with the efficiency of smoke dispersing in wind. "We've got search teams combing 100 square miles," Janet's voice crackled through the phone connection, made worse by the remote location and Sarah's growing panic. "But you have to understand, this is wild country. Grizzlies, mountain lions, temperatures that drop to 20 below at night, even if we find him." The unspoken words hung in the air like a death sentence. Phantom had been raised by humans from puppyhood. He'd never learned to hunt wild prey or navigate the brutal hierarchy of wolf packs. In the unforgiving Montana wilderness, his domesticated instincts would become liabilities that could kill him within days. Sarah drove through the night, her ancient Honda Civic loaded with camping gear and a desperation that bordered on madness. Eleanor had begged her not to go. Frank had offered to accompany her, but this was something she had to do alone. The math was simple and terrible. Every hour that passed reduced Phantom's chances of survival. She reached Kalispell, Montana after 14 hours of driving that blurred into a caffeine-fueled nightmare of mountain highways and increasingly frantic phone calls to search coordinators. The Big Sky Sanctuary sat in a valley surrounded by peaks that looked like sleeping giants, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. Marcus Webb was waiting for her in the parking lot. "How did you—" Sarah began, then stopped. It didn't matter how he'd known she would come. What mattered was the expression on his face, a mixture of guilt and determination that she recognized from her own mirror. "I couldn't let you do this alone," he said simply. "This is my fault. If I hadn't been so rigid, so convinced I knew what was best." They joined the search teams at dawn, following experienced trackers through terrain that humbled Sarah's suburban sensibilities. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, carpeted with forests so dense that 100 wolves could hide without leaving a trace. Snow had begun falling during the night, erasing any tracks Phantom might have left. On the second day, they found blood. The crimson droplets on fresh snow told a story none of them wanted to read. Something had injured Phantom, whether another animal, a fall, or simple exposure to the elements remained unclear. The trail led deeper into the wilderness, toward a region the park rangers called the Dead Zone, because cell phone coverage ended and human rescue became virtually impossible. "We need to turn back," the lead tracker, a weathered Blackfeet woman named Marie, said as they stared at the blood trail disappearing into a stand of lodgepole pines. "Storm's coming in, and this terrain gets dangerous fast." But Sarah was already pushing forward, following the crimson breadcrumbs with the single-minded focus of someone who'd lost everything worth losing. Webb stayed with her, matching her desperate pace through undergrowth that tore at their clothes and exposed skin. They found Phantom near sunset on the third day, collapsed beside a frozen stream in a clearing that felt like the edge of the world. His silver-gray coat was matted with blood and ice, his breathing shallow and labored. One of his hind legs bent at an angle that made Sarah's stomach clench with recognition, compound fracture, probably from a fall. "Hey, baby," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. Phantom's amber eyes opened at the sound of her voice, and his tail gave a single weak thump against the snow. Even dying, even broken, he was trying to tell her he was glad she'd come. Webb knelt on Phantom's other side, his hands gentle as he assessed the damage. "Hypothermia, dehydration, that leg's definitely broken. We need to get him out of here now." The evacuation became a nightmare of improvised stretchers and human endurance pushed beyond reasonable limits. Sarah and Webb took turns carrying the 100-pound wolf dog through terrain that challenged experienced hikers. Phantom remained conscious but weak, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face during the hours-long trek back to civilization. The veterinary hospital in Kalispell worked through the night, battling hypothermia and infection while Sarah paced the waiting room like a caged animal. Webb sat beside her, sharing coffee that tasted like salvation and silence that felt like understanding. "I keep thinking about my son," Webb said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the night of his accident. How I was so focused on doing my job that I forgot what really mattered." Sarah looked at him, seeing past the uniform for the first time. "What really mattered?" "Family," Webb said simply. "Tommy's been following your story since the beginning. Asked me why I was trying to break up a family that loved each other. 10 years old, and he understood something I'd spent 3 years trying to forget." The veterinarian emerged at dawn with news that felt like a reprieve from a death sentence. Phantom would survive, though the broken leg would require surgery and months of rehabilitation. More importantly, the wolf dog's escape had triggered a federal investigation into sanctuary protocols that revealed shocking deficiencies in security and animal care. "The facility will likely lose its license," Dr. Rebecca Martinez explained as they stood outside Phantom's recovery room, "which means legal custody reverts to the original owner pending resolution of his case." Sarah pressed her face against the observation window, watching Phantom sleep under warming blankets with IV lines threading his massive forearms. He looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way that reminded her of the frightened puppy she'd found in a storm 18 months ago. "What happens now?" she asked. Webb cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in the plastic hospital chair. "Now we have to make some decisions about what really matters." But Sarah wasn't listening. Through the glass, Phantom's eyes had opened, and even drugged and broken, his amber gaze found hers across the sterile distance. And his tail moved slightly against the warming blankets, a signal, a promise, a reminder that some bonds transcend law and logic and every reasonable argument against hope. Outside the hospital windows, Montana snow continued to fall, but inside a small room that smelled of antiseptic and second chances, a family was beginning to heal. The revelation came not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of truth finally breaking through decades of buried bureaucratic secrets. Dr. Martinez's call reached Sarah while she sat beside Phantom's recovery bed in the Kalispell Veterinary Hospital, her hand gently stroking his silver-gray fur as he slept off the anesthesia from his leg surgery. "Sarah, you need to hear this," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd stumbled onto something bigger than anyone had imagined. "The blood work we ran on Phantom revealed something unusual, genetic markers that don't occur naturally in wolf-dog hybrids." Sarah's stomach clenched with familiar dread. "What kind of markers?" "The kind that suggests selective breeding for specific traits, intelligence enhancement, emotional responsiveness, reduced aggression toward humans. This wasn't accidental crossbreeding, Sarah. Someone engineered Phantom's genetics with very specific goals in mind." The phone call triggered a federal investigation that unraveled like a conspiracy thriller, revealing a network of illegal breeding facilities operating under the cover of legitimate research institutes. The truck driver who'd been carrying Phantom that stormy night 18 months ago had been transporting animals from a facility called Northwind Genetics, a company that had been conducting unauthorized experiments in animal-human emotional bonding for military and therapeutic applications. Marcus Webb found himself at the center of the investigation when federal agents discovered his department had been receiving annual donations from Northwind's parent company for the past 5 years. The money had been earmarked for public safety education, but the timing of the donations coincided suspiciously with several cases where exotic animal violations had been handled with unusual leniency, except in cases involving Northwind's competitors. "I never knew," Webb told Sarah during one of their long conversations in the hospital waiting room. "The donations went through the department's general fund. I thought I was just doing my job." But the deeper investigators dug, the more complicated the truth became. Webb's son, Tommy, hadn't been injured by an exotic animal attack at all. That was a fiction Webb's traumatized mind had constructed to cope with a more devastating truth. The real accident had occurred when Webb, rushing to respond to a false report about a loose tiger, had run a red light and collided with another vehicle. Tommy's paralysis was the result of his father's misplaced urgency to contain a threat that never existed. "The therapy records don't lie," the federal investigator, Agent Sarah Chen, explained during a meeting that felt more like an intervention than a briefing. Your son's accident happened 3 blocks from your house, not at an exotic animal incident. The traumatic memory restructuring is actually more common than you'd think in cases involving parental guilt. Webb's world collapsed and rebuilt itself in the space of a single afternoon. 3 years of righteous crusading against dangerous animals evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind only the stark reality of a father who'd been running from his own culpability. That evening, he drove to the Children's Rehabilitation Center where Tommy was staying and had the hardest conversation of his life. "Dad, I already knew," Tommy said simply, his 10-year-old wisdom cutting through years of adult deception. "Mom told me last year. She said you blamed yourself so much you couldn't remember what really happened." Webb knelt beside his son's wheelchair, tears flowing freely for the first time since the accident. "Tommy, I'm so sorry for everything, for the accident, for not being there, for spending 3 years chasing ghosts instead of being your father. Dad, can we go see Sarah and Phantom? I want to meet the wolf who saved that little boy." Meanwhile, the federal investigation had revealed that Phantom wasn't just any wolf-dog hybrid. He was part of a small group of animals bred specifically for therapeutic work with trauma victims. His exceptional intelligence, emotional sensitivity, and lack of aggressive tendencies weren't accidents of nature but the result of careful genetic selection spanning multiple generations. "He's essentially a living therapy animal," Dr. Rebecca Martinez explained to a hastily convened federal hearing in Austin. "The genetic modifications enhance empathy and human bonding while suppressing predatory instincts. In many ways, he's safer around humans than most domestic dogs." The hearing took place in the same courthouse where Sarah had faced that original devastating verdict 18 months earlier. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Eleanor sat in the front row, having flown to Austin despite her doctor's warnings about the stress on her 78-year-old heart. Frank Rodriguez appeared via video link from his hospital bed, where he was recovering from a minor stroke brought on by the stress of watching his makeshift family torn apart. "Your Honor," Frank's voice crackled through the courtroom speakers, weak but determined. "I've lived through one war and watched 3 generations of my family grow up on Maple Street. That wolf dog has shown more loyalty and courage than half the humans I've known. If we're going to judge him by his actions instead of his species, then he's earned his place in our community." Tommy Webb, brought to the hearing in his wheelchair, provided the most compelling testimony of all. "Phantom didn't choose to be part wolf," he said, his young voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "But he chose to save Miguel when he could have just stayed safe in his yard. That's what heroes do. They choose to help when they don't have to." The federal judge, Patricia Richardson, had presided over exotic animal cases for 15 years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the complexities of United States Vos Northwind genetics and the peripheral case of one genetically modified wolf dog named Phantom. This court finds that the animal in question was the product of illegal experimentation conducted without proper oversight or ethical consideration, Judge Richardson declared. However, the evidence shows that said animal poses no threat to public safety and has, in fact, demonstrated exceptional service to the community. Sarah held her breath as the judge continued. "Therefore, this court orders the immediate termination of all state and local proceedings against Miss Sarah Mitchell and grants federal protection status to the animal designated as Phantom, pending the establishment of appropriate care protocols." The courtroom erupted in cheers that could be heard 3 blocks away. Eleanor openly wept. Frank's medical monitors spiked with excitement, and Tommy Webb clapped so enthusiastically his wheelchair nearly tipped over. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court recommends that the state of Texas implement emergency legislation tentatively titled Phantom's Law, establishing protocols for the care and keeping of therapeutically modified animals. "Miss Mitchell, Your dedication to this animal has exposed serious flaws in our regulatory system. This court suggests you consider testifying before the state legislature when this bill comes up for consideration." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Texas State Capitol building, Phantom at her side wearing an official therapy animal vest, addressing a joint session of the legislature. The silver-gray wolf dog sat with perfect composure as cameras flashed and representatives asked questions about human-animal bonds, genetic modification ethics, and the future of therapeutic animal programs. Phantom didn't choose to be different, Sarah told the assembled lawmakers, echoing Tommy Webb's words from the federal hearing. But when faced with a choice between safety and service, he chose to help. That's the kind of character we should be protecting, not prosecuting. Phantom's law passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishing Texas as the first state to create legal protections for therapeutically modified animals. The legislation included provisions for special licensing, regular health monitoring, and community service requirements that turned Phantom into something unprecedented, a wolf dog with a job. The new law also established the Phantom Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting other families dealing with exotic animal custody issues. Sarah found herself thrust into the role of executive director, traveling across the country to testify in similar cases and help draft legislation that balanced public safety with animal welfare. Eleanor, now 79 and officially Sarah's adopted grandmother, became the foundation's volunteer coordinator, organizing everything from fundraising galas to educational programs with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 50 years managing classrooms full of energetic children. "Honey, you've started something bigger than you know," Eleanor told Sarah one evening as they watched Phantom lead a therapy session with veterans at the Austin VA hospital. "That animal's not just healing people, he's changing how we think about family, about acceptance, about what it means to belong." Marcus Webb, who had resigned from wildlife control and retrained as a therapy animal coordinator, worked alongside Sarah and Phantom 3 days a week. His relationship with Tommy had healed to the point where father and son spent weekends camping in the Texas Hill Country, often accompanied by Phantom, who had learned to adjust his pace to match a wheelchair's capabilities. "You know what the funny thing is?" Webb told Sarah during one of their joint therapy sessions with disabled veterans. "I spent 3 years trying to prove that Phantom was dangerous, and now I can't imagine working without him. He reads people better than most trained counselors." The Veterans Program had become particularly close to Sarah's heart. Phantom seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to identify which veterans were struggling with PTSD, depression, or suicidal ideation. He would position himself near someone who needed comfort, offering his presence without being intrusive, somehow knowing exactly when a gentle nudge or a warm weight against someone's leg could make the difference between hope and despair. Frank Rodriguez, now 83 and moving more slowly after his stroke, had become the program's unofficial historian, documenting the stories of healing and connection that seemed to follow Phantom wherever he went. "That animal's got a calling," Frank observed, watching Phantom help a young Marine work through a panic attack with nothing more than patient presence and intelligent amber eyes. "Some folks are born to heal. Doesn't matter if they walk on 2 legs or 4. Dr. James Harrison, who had discovered Phantom's true nature in that examining room so many months ago, had become both the Foundation's veterinary advisor and Sarah's romantic partner. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared values and the kind of deep compatibility that emerges from facing crisis together. "I never expected to fall in love with a woman who comes with a 100-pound wolf dog," James admitted during their engagement party, which Eleanor had insisted on hosting in Sarah's backyard. "But then again, I never expected to meet someone who would change an entire state's laws for the sake of love." The engagement party was attended by an unlikely collection of people whose lives had been touched by Phantom's story. Miguel Hernandez, now 10 and an aspiring veterinarian, played fetch with Phantom while his parents chatted with Eleanor about neighborhood watch programs. Tommy Webb, 13 and increasingly independent despite his wheelchair, had appointed himself Phantom's official biographer, documenting every therapy session and community appearance with the thoroughness of someone who understood the historic nature of what they were witnessing. Phantom's not just our family's success story, Sarah told the assembled guests as the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. He's proof that love doesn't recognize boundaries, that family isn't about blood or species, and that sometimes the most important battles are worth fighting even when they seem impossible. Phantom himself seemed to understand the significance of the moment. As Sarah spoke, he moved through the crowd with dignified purpose, accepting pats and scratches from children who had grown up hearing his story, acknowledging the veterans who had found healing in his presence, and finally settling beside Eleanor's chair with the contentment of someone who had found his place in the world. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah found herself sitting on her back steps with Phantom's massive head in her lap, just as she had during those dark days when losing him seemed inevitable. But now, instead of despair, she felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had fought for love and won. "You know what I realized today?" she told him, scratching behind his ears in the spot that always made his tail thump with contentment. "You didn't just save Miguel from drowning that day. You saved all of us from drowning in our own fears and prejudices." Phantom's amber eyes reflected the last light of the Texas day, ancient and knowing and infinitely patient. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more legislation to draft, more families to help, more lives to heal. But tonight, in a backyard that had become the unofficial headquarters of a movement that was changing how America thought about love and family, a woman and her wolf dog sat in perfect contentment, surrounded by the people who had chosen to become their pack. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee and a dog biscuit that was approximately the size of a dinner roll. "Thought you two might want some refreshments," she said, settling into the lawn chair that had become her official spot for evening conversations. "Eleanor," Sarah said, accepting the coffee with grateful hands, "thank you for everything, for believing in us when no one else would." "Honey," Eleanor replied, watching Phantom demolish his biscuit with the enthusiasm of someone who had learned to appreciate life's simple pleasures. "Family takes care of family. And this right here, this is what family looks like." As if summoned by the word family, Frank's voice carried across the evening air from his own backyard. "Hey, Sarah, Channel 8 wants to interview you and Phantom for their anniversary special, something about hope and second chances." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying all the joy of someone who had learned that sometimes the craziest decisions turn out to be the best ones of your life. "Tell them we'll be right there," she called back. "After all, we've got a story to tell." And they did. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't between 2 people. They're between hearts that recognize each other across impossible odds. When Sarah found Phantom broken and abandoned in that Texas storm, she thought she was rescuing a puppy. What she discovered was a family member who would teach an entire state that love doesn't need papers, permits, or government approval. Like so many of us who've lived long enough to understand that family isn't always about blood, Sarah learned that the bonds we choose are often stronger than the ones we're born with. Phantom didn't just save little Miguel from drowning, he saved Sarah from a life of loneliness, gave Marcus Webb a chance at redemption, and reminded Eleanor that being a grandmother has nothing to do with genetics. Their story proves what we've always known in our hearts, that loyalty, courage, and unconditional love are the only qualifications that truly matter for family membership. In a world that often feels divided and cold, Sarah and Phantom's journey reminds us that one act of compassion can change not just a life, but an entire community. Sometimes the best families are the ones we rescue, and sometimes they rescue us right back. Questions for our community. Have you ever rescued an animal that ended up rescuing you? What moment taught you that family extends beyond blood relations? Please share your own stories of unexpected family in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love found you when you least expected it.